If you would like to get the look of classic analog film with your digital photography, well, I think you're going to enjoy this video today, because this video is all about Dehancer Photo, a new film emulation plugin that is currently available for Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Lightroom Classic. And from what I understand, there is a version for Capture One that is going to be coming out soon as well, may already be out by the time you watch this video. Now, if the name Dehancer sounds familiar, well, you probably edit video using DaVinci Resolve, because Dehancer also makes a popular film emulation plugin for that particular application for colorists who want to get the look of classic Hollywood film stock. But the plugin that I'm going to be reviewing and talking about in this video today is designed for still photography. And though it does share some of the same tools and some of the same effects, it is a different plugin. So let's jump in and let's edit our first image. Now, in order to edit a raw photo in Dehancer Photo, that raw file has to be a 16-bit sRGB TIFF image. We cannot open just a straight up raw image or a DNG file. Lightroom will generate a TIFF file from the raw image using whatever settings you have applied to the raw image, and then open up that TIFF image in Dehancer Photo. To get the best results possible, you kind of need to do a little bit of pre-processing with your raw image before you open it up in Dehancer Photo to get the best possible results. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Okay, so what you're looking at here, this is a raw DNG file. And the first thing you want to do here is just go through and do any baseline adjustments, any baseline tweaks that need to be done, crop the image however you want it to be done. Also go in and fix any color cast issues there may be with the image. You may also want to adjust the white balance while you're in there. Dehancer also recommends doing some additional tweaks to the photo to further compress the dynamic range and remove some of the contrast that Adobe Lightroom applies to all raw images when they're imported. So they recommend doing the following. First, come up here to Profile and change it from Adobe Color to Adobe Standard, bringing this back to -60, somewhere right around there, and then pulling the black point up. Now you can see that the tonal values are sitting right here in the middle of the image. This isn't necessary for every image. If your image is already kind of flat tonal-wise, you don't really need to do these things. But if you open an image in Dehancer Photo and start applying film emulation profiles, and the image starts to look kind of muddy and kind of dark, it was probably too contrasty when you imported it into the software. So just keep this in mind and do whatever you need to do to the image, and then you're ready to go. Okay, so now finally, let's open up this image in Dehancer Photo. We're going to right-click on the raw file, choose Edit In, and then we're going to choose Dehancer. And then this little modal will pop up and it'll say Edit a Copy with Lightroom Adjustments, and all the other ones are disabled. That's perfectly fine. You can toggle this open actually just to confirm the settings that are being used. Those are all correct. And then click Edit, and then a TIFF file will be automatically generated, and then Dehancer Photo will open. And this is the interface for Dehancer Photo. So let's do a quick tour of it here. Over here in the left column are all of the film emulation profiles. Then over here in the right column, this is where all the additional editing tools and special effects are located. Then up here in the top of the toolbar, we have profiles and presets, a toggle up here. If you apply a profile and make some edits to the image, and you want to save those edits and then reuse them on another photo, well, you can. You just save it as a preset. Then we have a toggle here to collapse the left column if you need a little more space for your image. And then this cogwheel here, this is where you activate the software, and it's also where you download the film profiles. All the film profiles are downloaded remotely, which is great because then those profiles can be updated and improved over time, and they can be adding additional film profiles as well. And at the time of this review, there are 62 film profiles in Dehancer, but by the time you watch this video, they could very well have added more. Then to the right of that, we have undo and redo buttons here, plus a toggle here that can reset the image, and that just brings everything back, just resets everything to the default values in the interface. Then over here to the far right, we have a one-to-one view. This gives you like an actual size view of your image. And then next to that is a before and after toggle. So let me just actually apply a film profile really quick. And if you toggle that on and off, then you're able to see the original TIFF file and the changes that you've made. Then cancel and OK. When you click OK, all of the changes and the edits that you've made to the photo are then saved back to that TIFF file that Adobe Lightroom generated. All right, good. We got all that out of the way. Let's move on and let's have some fun here and let's apply a film emulation profile to this image. Now, the first thing to know about film emulation profiles is that you don't actually have to apply one to your image. If you just want one of the special effects, something like grain, you can just apply grain to an image that has already been edited, already been color graded. You don't have to apply a profile, and you can actually toggle the profiles off by toggling this box here. And I know from experimenting with this and trying out a number of different emulations, I know which one works best, and that is to come down here to color positive, also known as slide film, and we're going to choose Fujichrome Velvia 50. Now, for those of you who are Fuji fans, or those of you who are slide film enthusiasts, you are probably well aware of Velvia 50. Just a really beautiful, richly saturated slide film. And unfortunately, Fuji is, they've been having some problems lately. If you've been following photography news with their sourcing ingredients and I guess chemicals and things for their film. Now, the reason I picked Velvia 50 for this particular image is because it has just that rich color, that nice magenta and purple kind of color cast to it. It looks great with an image like this, where I want more color. I want more richly saturated color. And that's something that you typically get with a color positive slide films. It's part of the reason why people choose those types of films. Now, the next important thing to pay attention to here in the film profile box is this push-pull EV slider. What this is and what this emulates. If you are not familiar with the difference between film and digital, when it comes to how they react and how they behave when an image has been overexposed or underexposed, with digital, you overexpose, the image gets brighter. When you underexpose, the image gets darker. But film, however, is completely different because when you overexpose or underexpose film, yes, sometimes it does get brighter and darker, especially in the case of color positive slide film, but sometimes the color balance of the image can change, the colors in the image can change, the contrast of the image can change. There's all kinds of unpredictable and weird and rather fascinating things that can happen with every one of these films when they have been overexposed or underexposed, whether that's in camera or in a dark room when, actually making a print. So what Dehancer has done here with Dehancer Photo is built into each one of these profiles, overexposed and underexposed versions of each. So let me show you what happens when we overexpose Velvia 50. And I'm just going to overexpose here by pushing this slider up to, let's just park it right around 1. That is one stop over. And you can see here the effect that it's had. Let me just do that one more time so you're able to see the difference. This is normal exposure. And I'm just going to type in 1 just to make this faster. And you can see that we get a completely different image. It is much warmer now. Yes, it is brighter, but it's also much warmer. There's more yellow, there's less magenta in the image. It looks like a completely different film stock here because it has been overexposed. Okay, so I actually don't want this to be warm like that. I like the blue hour kind of magenta look that we have going on here. So let's just keep Velvia 50 and we're gonna close this panel, come over here to the right column, and let's start adding some additional edits here. Now, to begin, we have a source panel. Now, here is where you can adjust the color temperature if you need to be making some further adjustments to it. There's a tint control too. There's also defringe and defringe radius. This is chromatic aberration, if that is something you need to do to the photo that you didn't already do to the raw image in Lightroom. So let's close that and move on to the next one. And then we have expand. Now, expand, this is where you are able to control the black point and the white point of the image. So if you want to give the image a little more of like a film-like fade, I can pull the black point into the negative, which pushes it further towards the midtones. And I can also do the same with the white point. I can push the white point further out towards the right side of the histogram and brighten it up a little bit. And actually, I think I'm going to bring back some of that softness in the black point because I liked how that looked. And we can toggle that panel on and off, and we can see the difference that it's made. So I've adjusted the overall brightness and exposure of the image in addition to its contrast. All right, so let's just park it right there for now and close expand, and then we're going to move on to the print panel. Film emulation is viewed as a two-step process where you have the emulation of the film itself, like what the actual negative looks like. And then you have the emulation of what that negative looks like, what that image looks like when it has been printed. And by printed, I mean either creating like an actual, like print on paper of a photo, or in the case of video, if that footage is then printed onto a motion picture film stock, where they use one type of film to be shooting the movie with, to be capturing all the footage with, and then all that footage is color graded, and then they print that film to a film stock like Kodak 2383 print film. And this also gives you additional tonal control over exposure, contrast, color density, saturation. So let's do a little bit of that. So I'm gonna pull down the exposure a little bit because I think it's just a little bit too bright. And if your image is a little too flat after pulling back on that contrast in Lightroom, here is where you can push up your tonal contrast and really kind of thicken up the image a little bit. I think right around there looks good. So let's actually preview everything we've done so far. So there is the raw image, and this is the film emulation. And this is just with the edit set we just applied, which is a pretty big change, right? We've definitely added a fair amount of contrast to the image. Now the next option down is color head. Now you may look at that and think, what in the world is that all about? Like, why is that called color head? That's awfully weird. Well, it's called color head because this is emulating traditional photography darkroom equipment, where in a darkroom with an enlarger, there's a thing called a color head. And in the color head, you're able to change and colorize the light that is used when you are making a photography print. Normally, the light is just pure neutral. There's no color to it at all, so that the colors in the photo are not affected. In a color head, though, you can manipulate the color of light by adding a little bit of cyan, a little bit of magenta, a little bit of yellow. And because print is a subtractive color process, if you were to say add a little bit of magenta light, magenta would actually be subtracted from the image that you create, which is backwards, right? I mean, it sounds kind of nuts, but by adding that magenta light to the color head, it is then blocking more of the magenta colors that are in the image, so you end up with more green in your shot. So these are things you don't really have to know. I mean, Dehancer, designed the interface here to make it pretty simple and make it a little more digital, but thought you might be interested to know in case you're, kind of wondering what this terminology is all about. So in color head here, we have sliders for yellow, blue, magenta, green, and cyan red. And if I wanted to kind of emphasize the magenta in this image a little bit and pull out some of that yellow, I would push the magenta slider, magenta green slider a little more towards magenta. And then I'm going to add a little bit of blue to the shot as well, because I want to cool it down a little bit, pull out some of that yellow and there, the white point is starting to change a little bit. It's starting to get more of that kind of like evening look to it. And if I toggle this on and off, see how much of a change it made? We just pulled a little more of that yellow out, and it's really starting to look good now. Now, one of the interesting things about color head, in case you're curious to know, you see this preserve exposure slider here? So this is set to 100% by default, which means that Dehancer Photo will protect the brightness in the photo when you are making these hue adjustments. It's not going to affect the exposure or brightness of the shot. But the reason this is here is because if we drop this slider all the way down to 0, so watch what happens when I push this magenta green slider up. You see how the image is getting brighter? And actually we can just gang all three of these sliders together, and let's just do this really quick. See how the image is getting brighter? Is because we're adding that light through the color head, and so the print ends up getting brighter. But if we reduce it and pull it down, we are then thickening up the image some. We're increasing the saturation, not just making it darker, but we're also thickening up all those colors in the image as well. So it's kind of a cool thing, especially for those of you who are, really into film and you know how all this works. That is one way to get an effect that is very, very similar to how this works in a photography darkroom. And then finally, all the way down here at the bottom of the panel, let me close color head, is Vignette. Now this is just like, a Vignette tool in Lightroom. You can actually turn the feather, drop it all the way down in order to see the shape. And then you're able to change the aspect ratio of it, probably something more of like an oval, maybe increase the size some. Then we're able to control how little or how much vignette is applied. Nothing really different, nothing special, that's all that different from Lightroom. This is the kind of thing that you could actually do in Lightroom. Doesn't have to be done here if you don't want to. Okay, so now's a great time, I think, to be circling back to what it was we skipped over earlier, and we're going to take a look at film grain. Now, film grain and the next two effects that we're going to be taking a look at thereafter, these are things that are unique to Dehancer Photo that are not available in a digital raw photography workflow. And yes, they are things that you could do if you have sufficient skill and experience with something like Photoshop, but this tool makes it so much easier. So let's jump in here and let's take a look at film grain. Now to see the grain, I'm going to click on 1:1 just to bring this up a little bit. And you can see on your screen here, you can see just how clear and clean everything looks, right? For a digital image, it looks really nice. But remember, we're doing a film emulation here. So we're going to click on film grain, and you'll notice immediately just how the whole texture of the image changes. Everything starts to kind of gel and blend together a little bit more. It starts to feel like a little bit thicker, like there's just a little more like depth and like substance to the image. It doesn't feel quite as flat. And I think adding the grain really sells the effect and really makes the film emulation look more authentic. Now, the thing that's really interesting about film grain, actually there's two really interesting things about film grain here. The first of which is that, yes, you have control over size and amount. Like that's pretty standard. Like that's what you would expect to see in Lightroom. But then you have additional controls here for shadows, midtones, and highlights. And what this allows you to do is to control the amount of grain that is being applied depending on the tonal values in the image. So you could apply more grain to your highlights and then pull all the grain out of your shadows and your blacks. With the shadows pulled all the way back, there's no grain here in the shadows, but there is some grain here in the midtones and definitely some grain up here in the highlights as well. Again, this is something where if you're passionate about grain, you can really get in and, and fine tune it to your liking and get it exactly in the regions that you want. Now, the next really interesting thing about film grain in Dehancer Photo is that it includes a color slider. Now, let me just crank this color all the way up. This may be kind of hard to see in a YouTube video, but in this neutral area on the side of the camper van here, notice how the grain almost appears to have like little flecks of magenta and green and blue in it. The grain is not monochromatic. It is not black and white. Color film has colorful grain. And yet when grain is applied in Lightroom or Capture One or whatever, it is always monochromatic. You always get monochromatic grain, which just doesn't, it doesn't resemble the actual grain that you would get if this image had actually been shot using color film. We've come quite a long way, I think. Let's do another 1:1 here and take a look at things. And it's definitely starting to resemble more of the look of what you would expect from slide color film. Okay, the next effect is halation. This one is super cool. I think you're going to get a kick out of this. And in order to really see it, we need to switch photos here. So let's jump over to this one. Let's do Cinestill 800T, which if you know anything about film, like Cinestill is basically like re-rolled Kodak Vision 3 motion picture film. And I think the tungsten look at this, or a tungsten color temperature of the film, looks good. And that's something just to be aware of when you're picking films and you're going through here. It's just thinking about which film would be most appropriate for the type of image that you're shooting. So something like outdoors in broad daylight, you probably want a color negative film, especially if there's people and you're trying to get good skin tone. Whereas if it's a landscape or something like this, maybe a slide film or a tungsten based film if shooting indoors or outdoors at night. Okay, let's just kick this up a little bit, zoom in some. And we're going to take a look at this yellow neon piping here. I'm going to come down to halation. Now, halation, if you've never heard of halation before, halation is an effect, or I guess you could call it a defect actually. You get this reddish orange glow around areas of high contrast. It has to do with how with how the emulsion works in film, it's really not worth going too deep into, but it's the kind of thing that you see, especially when you have like a super bright light source against something dark, which is very common here with nighttime photography. So we're going to turn on halation. Let me just crank this up a little bit so we're able to really see it on YouTube. You see the edge of the yellow neon here? You see how there's this kind of like weird reddish orange kind of glow that's emanating off the side here? This is one of the unique things that just, is just inherent in the character and behavior of film. This is the kind of thing that film can do that digital is almost too precise for. Like this is digital here. Actually, let me revert it all the way back. This is digital here, but this really helps sell the effect, and it just gives it a little extra something. Halation is not just something that is limited to like neon lights or practical lights. If we turn on halation, you see this kind of like reddish glow that's happening around the tree here, because this tree is super high contrast against the sky. There's just a big tonal difference between the two. So don't get the impression that this is, that like halation is just something that is appropriate for neon lights or nighttime photography or anything like that. All right, the next effect in Dehancer Photo is bloom. Now, bloom is similar to halation in that it adds volume and it adds additional oomph, like to a light, to some type of practical light in your shot. But instead of like the glow kind of like emanating off of the sides and the edges of the light, this is contained within the light source. It just basically takes that light source and just blooms it out a bit more. Almost like what would occur if there was like some atmospheric haze or mist in front of the light. It would just give it a little more volume and a little more oomph in your final shot. I keep saying oomph, but anyway. And this is with bloom enabled, using just the default settings, and this is disabled. And you can see here that the bloom is just focusing just on the light source itself. It's just pushing that out just a little bit more. And now, you see the difference that we're getting? On a digital image sensor, it almost just doesn't really look like light. It just kind of looks, it's very clean, very perfect, but it just doesn't feel like light, if you know what I mean. So that's part of what these tools like bloom and halation are for. Okay, so next I want to show you an example of the motion picture film emulations in Dehancer Photo. Now these are mainly intended to be used with video, like if you were editing using DaVinci Resolve, but there's nothing stopping you here from using these with your digital raw photography as well, if that is the kind of vibe and look that you're going for. And I think you're going to get a kick out of this because it's probably going to look rather similar to some motion pictures that you've seen recently. Okay, so this image here I captured up in Chinatown, up in New York a number of years ago. Seemed like the perfect shot for this type of emulation. And I dropped the color temperature down to 3200 Kelvin just to, kind of neutralize this light that's inside of the store here. Now I've also lifted the blacks quite a bit in order to bring that up, and I may just bring up the exposure a little bit too. Maybe drop the highlight some just to balance it out. And yeah, now we have something that looks a little more like a log, like a video log footage. And we are going to pick the motion picture options here. Now there's two Fuji options here. Unfortunately, Fuji, from what I understand, is no longer in the motion picture film business. Like they're not making these films anymore. So Kodak is the only player now. So we have Kodak Vision 3, 200T, 250D, 500T, and 50D. And these are different speeds of Vision 3 motion picture film and different color temperatures too, with D for daylight and T for tungsten. And by the way, if you watch a film today and it was originally shot on film, it was probably shot using Kodak Vision 3. So we're gonna begin with, let's do Kodak Vision 3 500T, again, T for tungsten. And you can see that we're already starting to get that film look, like we're starting to pull some of that saturation out of the image. The highlights and the whites in the shot are starting to lean like a little more towards like a buttery kind of yellow look. But there's one additional step here that really sells the look, and that is the print emulation. This is what I was talking about earlier about how there's the emulation of the negative and there's the emulation of how that image is actually printed, whether that's to paper or to another film stock. And in today's world, in today's film world, if they're making print film, it's almost certainly Kodak 2383 print film. And check this out. So we're gonna choose Kodak 2383 print film, and watch what happens to the image now. You see how the black point is just lifted even more. You get this kind of like really milky looking contrast in the shot. And the lights, the highlights and the whites in here are even more kind of buttery yellow looking. And let me just do this before and after. And I mean, right? I mean, maybe it just needs a little, let me just add a little bit of tonal contrast here, just to kind of bring that in a little bit, because we probably don't need the black point quite so lifted, quite so faded. And there we go, quite a difference. I mean, I would bet that probably looks like a number of movies that you've seen recently with a fair amount of cyan, like in the shadows and the darker regions. And then that nice, warm, buttery yellow light in the highlights and the whites. I mean, once you see it, it's kind of hard not to notice it when you're watching some film. Okay, now let's take a look at an example using color negative film, specifically using color negative film for portraiture, or really any image where skin tone is an important part of the image. And we're going to be editing this image here. This is actually one that I captured. I was literally sitting at the table with my camera. This is down in Mexico. My wife and I were on a trip, much needed vacation away from the kids for a few days. And this image here, I've already dropped the contrast a bit, lifted the blacks, just to kind of, bring the tonality of it a little bit closer towards the midtones. This is actually the original image here, straight out of camera raw image. And this is the lifted version. And again, just trying to create a better baseline to be doing our emulation from. Okay, so let's do it. Let's go to Edit, Edit in Dehancer. Now, any guesses which film I'm going to pick for this one? Some of you out there probably know which direction I'm going in here. I'm going to go to Color Negative. Let's go down to Fujicolor Pro 400H. Why did I pick that? Well, because Fujicolor Pro 400H and Kodak Portra 400, and really Kodak Portra 400, Kodak Portra in general, these are portraiture films. These are designed for skin tone. They are designed to pull some of that excess like red and orange that can be in skin in order to make it more luminous, to make it just looks a lot nicer with these types of films, as opposed to like using, say, like slide film, something like that, or even something like Kodak Ektar. Those films just had way too much color saturation. Skin looks reddish and just meh. Like those films are really for landscape. These types of color negative films, this is the kind of stuff that like wedding photographers use, fashion photographers use. This is an appropriate film for this particular type of photo. So I'm just going to pull up the exposure here a little bit, inject some more contrast because I pulled quite a bit out. And yeah, now we're starting to get that Fuji look. Anyway, so yeah, so let's just look at the original. So that's the TIFF file that we originally came in with. And this is now with Fuji Pro 400H. Let me just go down and show you Kodak Portra in case you're interested. So let's do Kodak Portra 400. And as you can see, very, very similar to the Fuji Pro 400H. Portra is just even more desaturated. It's more of like it's a bit grayer. It's kind of up to you what you prefer and what you like. One Kodak film that I happen to like quite a lot is Kodak Gold 200. Kodak Gold was just like kind of like a basic consumer film, whereas Portra and those types of films were considered professional films. Kodak Gold was cheaper. Kind of like, drugstore kind of film. Man, there's something about Kodak Gold 200. I love the color of Kodak Gold 200. Honestly, I think this image looks just as good in Gold 200. It's different. It's not quite as minty. I don't know, maybe I take that back. I kind of like the Fuji colors still. I think it still looks the best. But gold looks awfully good as well. Some pretty cool negatives in here. Some agfas as well. And yeah, actually that one doesn't look bad at all. Cinestill, I can't remember if I mentioned this earlier, but Cinestill is a relatively new film, new-ish. I can't quite remember when it came out, but Cinestill is essentially like re-rolled Kodak Vision 3, which I talked about just a second ago with the Chinatown shot. And D stands for daylight and T stands for tungsten. So 50D is more of a daylight film and 800T is more of a tungsten flavor. And yeah, I mean, those are options. I think those look pretty well, but I think with this particular image, I think the Fuji Pro 400H is winning me over. I've been having so much fun using this application, mainly because like I'm just fascinated by the history of film and by the different types of film, the different characteristics and personalities of, you know, all these different flavors of film and the flaws of film in general. And I just think it's a fascinating medium, and it makes digital seem awfully dull and boring in comparison. And it's part of the reason why, you know, film continues to live on today with a lot of people, and why a lot of people just only shoot film. They have no interest in digital. And it's a lot of fun. It is super cool. I've just really been enjoying using this application and experimenting with it, trying out different looks, trying out different effects. But, you know, I don't think Dehancer Photo is for everyone. I think there are some things that may not work for some of you watching this video. One of the things would be Dehancer Photo is kind of like, it's like, you know, one meal at a time. Like it edits one image at a time. You can't batch process images. You have to open, you know, you can save presets and then open an image, apply a preset, close it. It's a bit more cumbersome. It's a bit messier because you end up with a bunch of TIFF images in your catalog, and you can't just easily batch a bunch of stuff. Like if you're, you know, that type of photographer and you need to do film emulations across a bunch of stuff, well, you might be better off using a preset or a profile or a style if you're using Capture One, because from a workflow perspective, those would certainly be faster than using this. But if that isn't you and you don't need to batch process a ton of images at once for a client, you know, something like that, and you're perfectly okay with editing one image at a time, Dehancer Photo is perfectly fine. Outside of that, I mean, no problems with crashing or abnormalities or weirdness, like nothing. I mean, the software seems mature, it works really well. There are some things that I think could be improved. Like I kind of wish the previews over here in the left column were larger. Like they could make a single column out of this to make the previews bigger, or they could do what Lightroom does, where you mouse over them and the main image in the center here changes. That would be cool. That would be a nice addition. Additionally, I think keyboard shortcuts would be nice. It doesn't appear to support any right now. Anyway, there's a few other little small things that I think could be improved in Dehancer Photo that I would like to see in a future version, and I'll put those in the blog post, which I'll link to down below if you care to check that out. That's it for me. If you have any questions about this video, feel free to leave a comment down below. You can also reach me over at Instagram. I'll put my information up here in the corner so you can find me over there. And it's also a link down below in the description. And again, one more time, you can download a free trial of Dehancer Photo, link down below. Also a 10% off coupon down there too, if you'd like to pick it up, or Dehancer for DaVinci Resolve, if that is of interest to you. You'll find that down below in the description. Thanks so much for being here. If you enjoyed this video and you would like to see more from me in the future, please remember to subscribe to this channel and give it a thumbs up as well. If you enjoyed this video, you got something out of it, it would help me out a great deal. Thanks to Dehancer for providing me with a copy of Dehancer Photo, and that is it. Thanks so much. See you next time.